Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the latest developments in Idlib, U.S. policy in Syria, and sanctions against the Iranian regime. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Jennifer Cafarella, Director of Intelligence Planning at the Institute for the Study of War, and Nicholas Heras, Fellow at the Center for New America Security. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to start by talking, and I want to ask you, Jennifer, about the Idlib situation. Obviously, this is a very complicated situation. When I've had you on the show last time, we did speak about this, but we were not where we are today. Now we're talking about Russia being ready to start a military campaign along, obviously, with the Assad regime and probably Iranian forces on the ground. How would you describe the situation that we're facing today in Idlib?
Sure. I think the current situation in Idlib is actually a standoff between pro-regime forces that would fight on behalf of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, supported by Russian air power, but actually not in this case augmented by a significant deployment of Iranian proxies. We haven't seen those military forces mobilize. So we have pro-regime forces, mainly Syrian, arrayed against a complex mix of anti-Assad forces in Idlib province that include al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as well as a number of other Syrian rebel groups to include major Turkish proxies. I think the most interesting dynamic at play in Idlib, and the reason why we're currently in a standoff rather yet a full military escalation, is Turkey's military involvement in Idlib. Turkey is trying to block a regime offensive and has actually committed its own military forces to do so.
I mean, how do you think that's going to develop? Because we also saw that Turkey was with, Erdogan was with Rouhani, the Iranian president, and Putin, talking about their, new alliances. But at the same time, there's that one issue that they did not agree on.
And it was made quite clear by President Erdogan that, from his perspective, Turkish national security is at stake. And I agree wholeheartedly with Jennifer that the difference between Idlib and what we saw develop in Daraa and Quneitra was that, unlike Jordan, Turkey is actually on the ground. And Turkey has established military observer posts. Turkey has been actively on the ground trying to organize a Syrian opposition force that could not only stand against Assad if needed, but also provide security for Idlib and potentially, depending on the conditions, confront al-Qaeda and some actors such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And we can tell coming out of the Tehran meeting that President Erdogan really is at a decision point. This is a shatter point in the Syrian conflict. If President Erdogan stands his ground in Idlib, the rest of what will follow is possible for U.S. strategy, which is to try to reinvigorate the Geneva process. If President Erdogan does not stand his ground in Idlib, what will happen is the Geneva process will be fatally wounded, and it is very unlikely that the United States will be able to achieve its goals in Syria.
Well, Nicholas did touch on the the Turkish position there. Do you think that Turkey will go against Russia in Idlib?
Well, look, that's a dynamic in this standoff. You have a NATO army deployed to a front line in very close proximity to Russian special forces and Russian military police. This is one of the reasons why I think it's in America's interest and the wider international community's interest to ensure that this de-escalates, not only to protect the vulnerable civilian populations that deserve our protection, but to ensure that we don't actually enter an international conflict in Syria.
Meaning that if there's a use of sarin gas, because this is the only red line that they've enforced so far.
The Trump administration has pursued an interesting strategy for public communication around the crisis in Idlib. There have, of course, been tweets from senior administration officials, including the big man himself, President Trump, concerning the U.S. concerns for humanitarian catastrophe that occur in Idlib. There have also been public statements that Assad should not use chemical weapons. But we've also started to hear leaks from the administration to the press here in the United States about specific target packages being prepared in the event that the Assad government unilaterally decides to conduct a campaign against Idlib, which is interesting. I haven't heard that before, and that is a new development. Now, of course, that could just be officials speaking by anonymity, trying to test the waters to see what would happen. But I do think that...
Can you describe and explain a little bit more what those packages are?
Yes. So the implication of what has been leaked over the last several days is that the target, if the Assad government decides to unilaterally enter Greater Idlib without an agreement between Turkey and Russia and the United States, the result could be U.S. and other partner country strikes against Assad's military installations elsewhere in Syria. And you even hear some reports that perhaps Russian and Iranian targets would be on the list. Now, I doubt that the Trump administration would take the escalation ladder to the extent where it would climb all the way to Russia and Iran. But it's interesting that Assad military targets are on that list. And what that says to me is that the new Trump team that is focused on Syria, Ambassador Jeffrey and Colonel Rayburn, understand the gravity of the situation, and that in a lot of ways, Greater Idlib is the key, the last remaining opposition-held area in Syria, if they want to unlock the Geneva puzzle.
I mean, there's also another question about Idlib, is that the Russian so-called solution means that Idlib will become a safer ground for HTS and Al-Qaeda, because that's going to only empower them. When you see massive loss of civilian life, devastation, anger, that's a ground, I mean, for recruitment for Al-Qaeda, which is already hated, it's marginalized today. What do you say about that?
Absolutely. Al-Qaeda's biggest propaganda tool is the atrocities committed by the Assad regime and its backers. It is therefore in America's interest, in the interest of the wider international community, to block any further gains by the Assad regime and its backers in Syria as part of a strategy ultimately to defeat Al-Qaeda inside of Syria. So I'm glad to see the administration is taking this seriously. We still, of course, have a lot of work to do. There are still some unknowns about at what threshold specifically the U.S. would consider engaging militarily. I think in some ways that ambiguity actually is a good thing, because it should make Assad sweat. It should make him consider very carefully how far up this escalation ladder against his own population he intends to go. So we'll see how that unfolds moving forward.
It's interesting you mentioned in the beginning of your comment that Iran is not very involved in this military campaign, even though we saw that there's high-level officials from Iran visiting Aleppo recently, that they were only being escorted and shown around those military bases by other Iranians on the ground, and that was a report that Orient aired recently. I mean, why do you think it's a strategical decision by Iran not to be involved, or are they probably infiltrating the Assad army to hide their identity? I mean, what is going on?
It's a very good question, actually. So Iranian forces and Iranian proxies are, of course, present in Aleppo and on other front lines around the Idlib pocket. What we haven't seen, though, is a significant mobilization of additional proxy forces, the kinds of tens of thousands of additional Afghan and Pakistani Shia foreign fighters that Iran typically mobilizes in advance of this kind of escalation. So are the Iranians there, and will they participate? Yes. They will coordinate with the regime. They are present in this zone, but they don't seem to be preparing to lead the offensive on the ground, potentially because they can't afford to take public casualties in Syria or be seen to be as directly involved militarily at this time.
What would you like to add to that?
No, I agree with Jennifer on that point, that we don't yet see the indicators of mass mobilization of Iran or its Hezbollah network proxies. And to the point that Jennifer made at the end of this conversation about this subject, Iran has a lot of fires it has to put out. Right now, there are mass protests in Basra that are directly challenging the Hashd Shabi organization, many of which are tied to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran is still in the thick of trying to stabilize the Syrian-Iraqi border in Deir ez-Zor, and we do see a number of the Hezbollah network militias that are present there. The Iranians are trying to test the resolve of the United States around Tanaf, which is another major situation. And I think if we take a step back and we look at the dynamics in Greater Idlib, fundamentally Russia should be more engaged in the conflict there, because Russia wants a larger buffer zone around Hmeimim base. And that's Russia's key strategic interest, is Russia's trying to make that air base in Latakia its coordinating base for all of its future activities in the Mideast. So for Russia, there's a real military need. For Iran, Aleppo is important for the economic interest, Damascus is important, and the strategic depth that's built for Hezbollah in the Syrian-Lebanese border area is important. But in a way, Idlib is sort of an orphan in Iran's strategy towards Syria.
What do you make of this new or latest meeting between Erdogan, Rouhani, and Putin? Is it a failed, I mean, there was some, speculations that the last meeting was a failed meeting, there's nothing accomplished, actually more disagreements than agreements. What do you make of it? And I would like you both to answer. You can start, Jennifer.
Sure. I think my question is failed according to whom? From the perspective of Turkey, the U.S., and Europe, I think it was a successful meeting. The offensive has not commenced on the ground. Erdogan was able actually to go to that meeting to stand his ground against the Russians and the Iranians and to make it clear that A, military escalation would have consequences. I expect that that message was delivered as part of the meeting. And B, that Turkey was using its own leverage, both military and diplomatic, to encourage Russia and Iran to opt for some kind of negotiated outcome in Idlib. That could still include a negotiated outcome where the Russians and the Assad regime are allowed to conduct a limited operation. We don't yet know. That engagement is still ongoing. But I think the fact that we haven't yet seen a major ground movement is a testament to the effectiveness of that meeting. It's also a testament to the fact that this issue over Idlib, as Nick mentioned earlier, has actually driven a wedge between Turkey and Russia within Syria. That's a new development. It's actually consistent with Turkey's long-term interests in Syria, which align with America's much more deeply than they align, and actually the Syrian peoples, in my view, than they align with the Russians. And so I think we actually have a changing diplomatic situation as a result of the conflict over Idlib that, as Nick mentioned, could actually create a renewed opportunity for engagement at the wider diplomatic settlement aperture in Geneva.
I just want to build off a point that Jennifer made. This is in many ways a victory of sorts for the United States and for Turkey. And
the Tehran meeting.
The Tehran meeting, and for states that are opposed to Bashar al-Assad's continued rule in Syria. I mean, I think fundamentally what Russia is trying to get from this diplomatic process, the Tehran meeting and all the meetings that are occurring this week, is a win without war scenario for Bashar al-Assad. Because fundamentally, Russia knows that it cannot afford the reconstruction of Syria. And what it wants to do is it wants to continue that process of renormalizing Bashar al-Assad. In order to renormalize Bashar al-Assad, it needs to prevent mass population displacement of the Syrians that are resident in Idlib that could potentially end up in Europe. And President Erdogan has already talked about that, and he's talked about that publicly and loudly, about the fact that one of the consequences of a campaign on Greater Idlib would be mass population displacement that would end up in Europe. And that strikes against the narrative that the war is over, that Bashar al-Assad has won, and that he's a responsible international actor. And so it is in Russia's interest for there not to be a major catastrophe in Greater Idlib. It's in Russia's interest to have Turkey agree to withdraw from Idlib and to consolidate its position in Afrin-Euphrates Shield. And on the Turkish side, there's no motivation to do that, because if Turkey withdraws from Idlib and reconsolidates its position in Afrin and Euphrates Shield, what is to guarantee that the next war won't be on Afrin and Euphrates Shield, or that the Assad government will work with the EPG to undermine Turkey's security position in those areas?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I want to talk about the American strategy that we just saw, like the outline of, kind of being, at least they have a more clear, coherent strategy that we finally saw. A lot of people were complaining that they haven't been seeing it. Now we know that there's, they want a friendly government in Syria that all the Syrian people agree on. And the United States is staying for now in the eastern Syria. Also that they want all the Iranian militias to leave Syria. I mean, obviously those are really good goals, very ambitious, but how? Do you think the administration has the tools to accomplish these goals and this overall strategy?
In my view, it's a question of on what time frame. I don't know on what time frame the administration thinks it is pursuing this policy. I don't personally think that a stable outcome in Syria is feasible in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, for the foreseeable future. We have had a very reactionary policy on the ground to date. I think we're starting to see signs that this administration, now that it has its feet underneath it and some really good people doing really great Syria policy work, is starting to think ahead. We've decided to stay. We are now crafting a policy to retain and exploit the leverage that we do have to constrain the Assad regime and its backers. I do expect that that puts us on solid ground to continue to pursue a longer-term strategy in Syria that does give the Syrian people some measure of hope that the future ahead of them is not as bleak as actually the Assad regime and the Russians intend to convince them that it is.
Good point.
And to build off Jennifer, I think if we unpack this new energy that the Trump administration has towards Syria over really the last few weeks, I mean, at its core, it's a counter-Iran strategy. And with a new Syria team in place, if you noticed, Secretary of Defense Mattis, in a press gaggle a couple weeks ago, explicitly linked the U.S. force presence in northern and eastern Syria to conditions based on the implementation of the Geneva process. And from the U.S. perspective, as I understand it, coming from the Trump administration, the two key conditions are the transition away from Bashar al-Assad and the withdrawal of Iranian forces and Iranian proxy forces that are part of the Hezbollah network. Now, I agree with Jennifer that fundamentally we have to consider the timescale here. This is a decade or more long effort. And I think it's interesting because earlier in the year, Trump administration officials, speaking both off the record and on the record, were quite concerned that Mr. Trump did not have an Afghanistan legacy in Syria. The current U.S. policy, of course, does not have the same type of investment, both in terms of reconstruction and rehabilitation for local communities and also U.S. force presence. But the idea of an enduring U.S. presence in some part of Syria for years to come is something that hasn't really been tested yet in public opinion. And that will be the first test for it. It may never come up, and we may have U.S. forces in Syria for a decade or more. The challenge will be, in order to get the Geneva conditions to occur, you need to put pressure on Iran. As it's currently constituted, U.S. forces in northern and eastern Syria aren't going to march on Damascus and are not going to remove Assad's regime and the linkages that Iran has made in the intelligence and security leadership of the regime. My guess is that part of this staged strategy that the administration is going for is to, over time, put pressure on Russia, both through sanctions to show Russia that, no, there is no pathway where you get others to pay for the reconstruction of Syria so long as Bashar al-Assad is power, and through territory to demonstrate that together, Turkey and the United States control more than half of Syria's territory, most of its oil resources, most of its most important water resources, and some of its most significant wheat and other agricultural producing regions. And that's a lot of power.
And then there's the new sanctions also. I mean, before I go to the sanctions, there is the SDF basically cutting its relations with the Assad regime. Do you think that was a part of a pressure by the administration on the SDF, because we know that the YPG, PYD had some sort of connections and obviously accusations from certain parties for dealing with the Assad regime, selling oil, keep working and coordinating. And obviously there's a history there of that kind of collaboration. Why do you think we're seeing that new SDF, basically there was casualties a couple of days ago between the Assad militia forces and the SDF, YPG checkpoints? What's happening there? Is it a new position that we're seeing by the SDF because of the new policy?
The SDF does seem to be pulling back a bit in its negotiations with the regime, although those negotiations actually weren't going that well for the YPG and the SDF to begin with, in part because the Assad regime continues to want to assert its political authority over SDF-held terrains, not only discuss military and security issues moving forward. But I do think the U.S. decision to stay matters. The United States of America is a much more significant ally, a much more valuable partner than the Assad regime and its backers could ever hope to be. The SDF knows this, and I think is calculating accordingly.
That's something Turkey accepts.
And that's the great question.
Yeah.
That is the great question, and that is the devil's dilemma of U.S. policy, because we have to recognize, first I would just say that from the beginning of the conflict, there's been movement of oil from Deir ez-Zor towards the Assad regime. Armed opposition groups that were there present in the area before the rise of ISIS did it. Part of the challenge, of course, is the SDF has expanded its administration to Deir ez-Zor, working by, with, and through local Syrian tribes. And a lot of these deals are made at the local level. And there was, of course, some EPG participation in that on that local level. But I'd say fundamentally, the U.S., we have to be clear here. The U.S. strategy wants to create a grand bargain with Turkey, but the United States is not going to abandon the heroic SDF and the work that the SDF has done to build stability in northern and eastern Syria. And we see that by the way the U.S. has approached Manbij, the administration of Manbij, joint patrols, and the way the U.S. talks about the SDF. There is a real kinship between the United States forces on the ground and the SDF. The question now is, how can you, as Jennifer alluded to, how do you get the SDF to realize that this is real and that it now has to be responsible for governing a large part of Syria for the indefinite future?
Yes.
And that requires U.S. investment in the SDF and other partner forces to create good governance so it can be responsible to the local population.
And I think that last piece is important, if I just could add to that. The U.S. presence has been relatively limited in the East, and of course we're not investing economically or really providing much humanitarian support in that part of the country. I do hope that changes. Doesn't seem likely under this administration, but I think the issue of the SDF's form of governance is critical. It's critical not only for the potential to broker some kind of deal with the Turks, but also to ensure that the areas in which the SDF is operating do not actually suffer a resurgence of ISIS or, God forbid, a resurgence in al-Qaeda, which of course was previously present in southeastern Syria before the rise of ISIS. I think the U.S. needs to pay a lot more attention to the alleged abuses of the SDF against the local population and take steps to ensure that our local partner is actually adhering to basic human rights and international law in these areas. And I think that's an important confidence-building step that we can make both towards the Turks and towards the local population.
I mean, there's that dilemma between Turkey and the SDF, and having those two allies work together somehow. I mean, do you think with the new team in the administration, people like Ambassador Jeffrey, obviously Joe Rayburn, who moved from the NSC, and, you know, and the White House officials, I mean, you know, John Bolton and his team, and Pompeo, I mean, do we have enough people to make this happen? Because this could be a key to resolving this overall conflict and have a much stronger front against the Iranian militias, the Islamic extremists, and the Assad regime.
Well, I would say that practically speaking, there are a few steps that need to follow. The confidence-building measures that are occurring between the United States and Turkey and Manbij need to continue. And that's an important bellwether. That's the canary in the coal mine of how well this relationship can develop. There's a lot of confidence needs to be built. But I would say then after that, what I'm looking for is that the EPG within the SDF has been co-administering certain places within northern and eastern Syria, such as Kamishli, such as Haseki, where we've begun to see a little bit more. We've seen clashes in the past between the two sides, and we've had the clash recently. But my understanding is there is concern within the administration towards the type of intelligence network that Hezbollah has built in places like Kamishli and in places like Deir ez-Zor that are a challenge, because this is a potential risk to U.S. forces that are deployed in eastern Syria and becomes a force protection issue. For me, the canary in the coal mine is if the SDF, via the EPG, begins to more directly challenge the remnants of the Assad regime in northeastern Syria. If we see that, that indicates a broader strategy that's afoot of reducing Iranian influence in eastern Syria, and that's the first front. The U.S. can't quite get at Iran in western Syria. Right now, that will be the responsibility of Israel as it chooses to do that. But in eastern Syria, as we've seen, the U.S. has shown resolve against Iran and Hezbollah network militias, and if the SDF has the same type of resolve, there's a big problem for the Assad regime.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think it's essential because Assad, Iran, and Russia have all been taking steps independently and in coordination to actually attack the SDF in eastern Syria in the event that the SDF's negotiations with the regimes break down. So I think the irony actually is a successful Turkish and American bloc of the Idlib operation could cause Assad and his backers to swing east and actually take a shot at compelling an SDF withdrawal from certain areas or, God forbid, inflicting casualties on U.S. forces. So I think a very active engagement is necessary to ensure that we are safe within SDF-held areas where, as Nick mentioned, the regime does have networks, so too do the Iranians. And I think that does pose a significant threat that we do need to eliminate.
Yeah, I just want to agree with Jennifer. I mean, it is incumbent upon the United States, as it builds on creating a grand bargain with Turkey, to support the heroic SDF and the work that the SDF has done to take the fight to ISIS and to continue to allow it to create structures of local governance and security that are resilient against the expansion of the regime and its network. We already saw in Topka, for example, where the local authorities in Topka are very concerned about a network that the regime and potentially ISIS, or the regime and ISIS working together, have built to try to undermine local authority. We obviously know about Raqqa, another problem area, Hasaka, Kamishli. Right now, we could see emerging over the next several months, if it is successful in Idlib, as Jennifer pointed out, the U.S. and Turkish efforts, that the regime will try to undermine the U.S. effort in northern eastern Syria. Because the longer that the U.S. is embedded in Syria, the more difficult it becomes for Russia to remove the United States, and the longer it takes for Assad to get the type of reconstruction funding he needs to survive. Assad is running out of oxygen right now.
Yeah, I did speak to some people in the Raqqa area, Arab Sunnis, who were extremely worried a while ago about the United States leaving. They were happy that things are moving forward. I mean, I heard they were talking to me because they're leading many human rights and grassroots organizations that they're trying to demine and rebuild, and they were meeting frequently with American officials, and they were asking that question: is the United States going to stay? We don't want the United States to leave. If they leave, we're going to be killed by the Assad regime and the Iranian militias. They were terrified. Now, obviously, people are getting reassured. And we're seeing right now that the United States is tackling the last pocket of ISIS fighters in the eastern Euphrates. What do you think the outcome would be from this battle? Is it going to be an easy final battle, and then we're not going to, this is going to be the last pocket of ISIS fighters for those who are hoping that, hey, we'll just pack up and leave after this. What do you expect for this last battle?
I personally expect ISIS to stand and fight, in part because I think the reason why ISIS is holding on to this piece of terrain is in part to buy time and keep the SDF tied up in clearing operations so that ISIS can work on establishing its networks both into SDF-held areas. As Nick mentioned, we've seen a resurgence in Tabqa and in Raqqa, but that ISIS can also prioritize re-infiltrating into areas that the Assad regime has ostensibly cleared but cannot actually secure. We, of course, saw the major and very deadly ISIS attack on Suwaida, and we've continued to see an ISIS resurgence in the desert, the eastern Homs Desert. And I think part of the strategy on ISIS's part in this Hajin pocket is to buy time and enable those other networks to move forward while the U.S. is engaged.
To emerge, basically.
Yeah. And, to build off of Jennifer's point, one of the dynamics that we've observed in Deir ez-Zor is that as the SDF has tried to approach the population of Deir ez-Zor in a more gradual manner, and it's had some successes and some setbacks. It's relied a lot on local networks of fighters that, also have to be mindful of the challenge that ISIS and Hajin in particular, that pocket represents, which is that it has succeeded in embedding itself in the local population. And this is a broader challenge in the counter-ISIS campaign in what we would call Syria, Iraq, Western Iraq, and Eastern Syria, is that recent estimates of the number of ISIS fighters that have been released by the U.S. military and by the United Nations, according to member states, are much larger than had been thought a few months ago. And the reason for that is our assessment of ISIS's strength is different. And that assessment is based on the fact that ISIS, over the last 5 years, as a result of governance vacuums that have occurred because of the civil wars in Iraq and in Syria, has had the opportunity to shape the local population, particularly youth. And that gives ISIS an enduring power that's very difficult to counter. And so, to Jennifer's point, the longer that ISIS can tie the SDF up, and the longer that ISIS can create conditions where there's animosity between local Arabs that are with the SDF and local Arabs that are with ISIS or nominally with ISIS or family members that are fighting with ISIS, the more difficult it is for the SDF in its heroic effort to govern after ISIS.
Those are challenges that we're probably going to be looking at in the future. But I want to go back to the Iranian militias in Syria. In your opinion, Jennifer, now when we talk about we want the Iranian militias to be out, and even though Nicholas mentioned that it's that bombing the Iranian bases in Syria is basically left to Israel, which is doing it continuously and creating huge losses for Iran. But what is the American strategy? I mean, now we're talking about infiltration in the Syrian army. We're talking about Hezbollah-style Iranian forces created in Syria slowly but surely. What do you imagine would be the American strategy, or how do you also recommend for them to tackle this issue?
Yeah, so the U.S. strategy against Iran in the region seems primarily to be to drive the continued economic isolation of Iran caused by the American decision to walk away from the JCPOA, and to ensure that the Iranians have as limited access to capital to spend on wars in Syria and military proxies in Iraq and Yemen as possible. So the administration is trying to undermine the Iranian regime's stability, to encourage, actually, I think, through economic means, the protest movement in Iran that is demanding that Iran, spend less money in places like Syria, and thereby to try to have an indirect effect on Iran's ability to fight in Syria and Iraq. I think that this is a viable strategy. I do think it needs a supporting effort in both Syria and Iraq to constrain the Iranian proxies that already exist, that already are developing local networks, have local sources of revenue, et cetera. So I think we still will need to see more from this administration, but I do give them credit for the strategy, and I give them credit for the difficult decision to stay in Syria in order to support that strategy by retaining forces.
What would you like to add to this?
No,
You're good at adding things, so
I would just say Jennifer really does summarize it well. I think that there are a few dynamics for us to watch. First of all, and this is true, and this is to Jennifer's point, the Syria strategy is an Iran strategy, and we should make no mistake about it. Mr. Trump's strategy towards Iran is regime change. It might not be violent overthrow of the Iranian regime, such as occurred against Saddam Hussein in the Iraq War, but it is, as Jennifer pointed out, a sort of death by 1,000 cuts. Economic sanctions, ethnic and sectarian disputes and demonstrations that seem to somehow inflame out of nowhere, and also the very real result of decades of policies by the Islamic Republic that has left many areas of that country severely environmentally degraded, has left many youth without good economic prospects, and has even created a crisis within the clergy that's the deep state of much of the decision-making that's made in Iran. In Syria, though, the challenge is, of course, that the U.S. is not going to march on Damascus, and there is no ready-made force that's going to march on Damascus. And my understanding is that the administration, the Trump team, believes that at the end of the day, Bashar al-Assad is a paid agent of Qasem Soleimani and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And under Bashar al-Assad's watch, since 2012, Iran has assembled a large reserve of missiles that can be supplied to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and has provided strategic depth for Hezbollah in the next war against Israel. And to get at that, you have to get at Western Syria. Politically, it's going to be infeasible for the United States to wage war against Bashar al-Assad in the way that it waged war against Saddam Hussein. So the strategy now is, well, we can just stay here. We cleared this area from ISIS. We did a service to the international community and to the Syrian people. We have some ownership for this. We should help rehabilitate this area. And I agree with Jennifer's point. There needs to be more funding for that. It's very important. And over time, the idea is the pressure all comes down on Russia. No, it's expensive to wage war abroad, and Russia has economic issues. Its economy is degrading. There's some questions the extent to which Russia can continue to prop up Bashar al-Assad, and doesn't have the money to help him reconstruct his country. So the war that we see now is the United States position itself, like you would in Monopoly, to be best prepared to win the war over the aftermath of the active war in Syria. And that means Russia and Vladimir Putin have to feel the pain in order to realize that there is no pathway forward for them to meet their goals if Bashar al-Assad sits on his throne in Damascus.
Now we have a new what do you call it, a bouquet of sanctions that's going to be basically implemented on Iran too in November. That is going to be by cutting the oil field, which will be, I mean, this is completely cutting off oxygen from the Iranian regime, especially that it's going to be more specific and more difficult even for other countries who used to boycott those sanctions before the JCPOA. How do you view this and basically the the effects of these new sanctions on the Iranian regime? How fast are we going to be seeing results?
Sure. Well, I think what you're getting from me and perhaps Nick, although I of course won't speak for him, is some relief actually that this administration has made a few very key decisions that have put us on a somewhat better trajectory inside of Syria and in the wider region. I think 6 months ago, we were looking at some very bleak outcomes to include an American withdrawal, potentially, and the handover of large parts of Syria that Americans died for, that coalition members died for, and of course, countless Syrians to liberate from ISIS. We were looking at the handover of that terrain to the Assad regime, which just truly, in my view, was one of the absolute worst possible outcomes inside of Syria. So we're now seeing change in the U.S. policy. We're seeing a willingness to engage. We're seeing a recognition of how much power the United States actually has in this theater. We haven't been acting like it, but we do. We have significant ability to impose costs on the Iranians, to block the Russians, and to put some constraints on the Assad regime. That doesn't mean the war is going to end. Nick and I have both stated this is going to likely go on for years to come, but there is some reason for cautious optimism and to expect that the U.S. is pivoting towards a much more sensible, in my view, and I think perhaps Nick's view, policy in the region, despite actually some of the concern over the President Trump's tweets and the way that he engages in foreign policy. I actually think the foreign policy decisions that have been made in the Middle East thus far have largely been good in recent days. Actually, in recent weeks, really, this is a fast-moving policy environment here in Washington, so we'll see.
And surprising. I mean, this is something that President Trump said during the elections. He doesn't like to tell our enemies what our next step is. And it's true that we've been getting a lot of surprises in the foreign policy. What would you like to, comment on this?
So one of the most interesting dynamics that Jennifer alluded to was this idea of how do you block Iran? And there's two challenges that the Trump team will have to manage moving forward. One challenge is how do you deter Iran, and particularly Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, from using the thousands of missiles that it's amassed in southern Lebanon and now in western Syria against Israel. And this is a real challenge. If in fact there is a crumbling or a degradation of the regime in Iran, at what point does the IRGC decide that it's time to launch that Mahdi Brennan war against Israel? That's one concern.
Because they're gonna we're gonna die anyways. Let's just do something.
And that's a deterrence issue, and that has to do with how do you get Russia to take Geneva seriously? How do you get Russia to take seriously that its position in Syria is threatened? Because fundamentally what Russia is going for is a reassertion of its influence over Syria that it had historically under the Cold War. President Putin is a Cold Warrior. His formative experience was the Cold War. The way he views the world is in the context of Cold War. And for him, the most successful accomplishment of the Syrian war, besides testing weapons, besides making arms sales, besides expanding the reach of Russia in the region, is Hamamein base and the naval pier that's being upgraded at Tartus, because that is a raw power reassertion that Russia is there to stay for the next century or more in the Middle East. And that isn't going to go away. We shouldn't have any illusion that Russia is going to withdraw from Syria. What we are talking about is Russia and the United States come into a melding of the minds that no, there's no pathway forward with Assad in power. And a major impediment to this pathway is that the fact that Iran is using Syria for other purposes than you are. Russia, as far as I understand, would like to maintain a balanced relationship with a number of different countries, including Israel. The current regime in Iran, its stated goal is to destroy Israel and to take the war to Israel. And that's going to be a challenge. And so that's part of the deterrence. How do you get Russia to deter Iran from using Syria to wage war in Israel? But then there's the diminishing piece of it. How do you diminish Iran? How do you reduce the forces that Iran has in Syria? How do you reduce the Hezbollah network that Iran has built in Syria? And the way that Iran is, as Jennifer alluded to, is Iran is trying to shape local Syrian loyalist forces to be beholden to Iran in a way that it's tried to do with the Hashid Shabi in Iraq.
Yes.
That's a longer battle. And that goes to, you diminish Iran by taking its attention elsewhere. You diminish Iran by forcing IRGC operatives to have to go back home and deal with the challenges there. You diminish Iran by forcing the Hashad groups to have to go back and respond to challenges in Iraq. And you diminish Iran by taking away its strategic deterrence that's developed in Yemen and it has in Western Syria. And so that's a long process, and it requires a lot of different pressure points.
Yep, and I think I would just add that it remains to be seen, actually, whether this administration is going to be able to follow through on these policies. I think we have some moments for optimism, as I've mentioned. We have some new positive momentum, But as Nick has laid out, there's an incredible amount of work yet to do,
Yes.
and there's still a lot of risks. And I very much trust that this administration is alive to the risks, that these professionals are taking it very seriously. But I think there still is a lot of room to think through subsequent phases after we've made this decision to stay, what next must follow actually, and how meaningfully do we start to rip out the roots of what the Iranians have dug in both Syria and Iraq, in addition to the capabilities they've put forward in Yemen. So a lot of work yet to do.
Do you agree with what Nicholas was saying, that they can just shoot their way out? I mean, we saw this strategy by the Assad regime with the help of the Iranians, with the help of the Russians. And while they're minority, you know, the Assad regime is from a minority, and all of them, its sect, the Alawites kind of gathered around Assad because of that. But now we have the majority, the Shia Persian majority is the main movement or movers behind the protests. Do you think they can just simply shoot their way out? What do you think of the situation?
I share Nick's concern that the regime in Tehran will choose to do so if the protests become sufficiently large and sustained, and the regime calculates that only violence remains their option in order to get themselves out of this problem. We haven't yet crossed that threshold, thankfully. I am concerned that it will happen. I am therefore also concerned that the U.S. can push too hard too fast and actually cause this regime to resort to some of its violent roots. And I hope for the good of the Iranian people that that does not happen. I think we are dealing with a murderous regime in many instances, and this is existential. So I think, as Nick has, I think, very carefully laid out, the question is, how can the Iranian population be given its opportunity to participate in its own governance? How can its own basic human rights be protected? And what role can the United States be as the leader of the free world and a champion for oppressed populations? Engage in a manner that is constructive and that preserves as much human life as possible.
And now we also see in the Iraq protests in the Busra, and also another Shia city where they have 95% of the Iraqi oil, while they don't have even clean water. I mean, this is just unbelievable situation. And they're protesting now, and they're getting killed. But what do you think what does that mean for Iraq? Well, now we don't even have the, the government hasn't been formed yet. There's all these debates, and Qasem Soleimani is trying to, shift things in one way or the other. And I want to hear your answer, both of you, on this as well. How do you see this situation in Basra basically move forward, and what would that mean to Iran? Because that also is going to have its own implications on the Iranian regime, because you also mentioned the Arabs, the Ahwaz, and their connection to the people in Basra. I mean, they're Arab, they're Shia. They have some sort of connection.
So Basra is a very interesting dynamic, and it's a challenge because Basra has been a bit of an orphan in Iraq's modern history. In some ways, Basra would have, had history gone differently, resembled more like one of the Gulf states in terms of its oil wealth, the way its population is based. Successive modern regimes in Iraq have oppressed Basra to various different ways. In the modern history of Iraq since 2003, Basra has been traditionally underserviced. It's been a city apart, and it's the most vital part of Iraq. I think that the challenge that it comes to Basra is that there are a lot of international interests tied into the oil industry that would like to see stability brought, one way or the other. And I think this is a dangerous moment for Iraq and potentially for the wider region, because what you begin to see in Basra is a movement away from popular protests that are concerned, bread and butter, everyday concerns. Water, clean water, the cost of electricity, the cost of housing, job opportunities, to now you begin to see political disagreements within a predominantly Shia population, within political parties within that Shia population. And it is reflective of a broader debate in the broader Iraqi society, which is how do you get responsible and good governance to meet the needs of the Iraqi people, and to what extent should Iraq be the wheel that turns Iran's interest in the broader region? Most of the foreign fighters that Iran has assembled for the Hezbollah network come from Iraq. Iran will always have a type of influence over Iraq because they're neighbors and there's large and long-standing social, cultural, political, and economic ties between the two countries. We shouldn't mistake ourselves that they will be neighbors and they will be tied to each other for time to come.
Yeah.
That having been said, there is a really interesting sub-dynamic, which is how do Iraqis in an underrepresented area express themselves in a way where they can take the power back? And this speaks to the same dynamics that Jennifer referred to in Iran. You see some similarities there because at the end of the day, it is a youthful population that doesn't see a brighter future for itself and feels that it's been let down by the politics of its forebears.
What do you think, Jennifer? Because this is a very also pressing issue, and it's affecting the Iranian regime directly because it is against Iran, even though it's in Iraq.
Sure, I do think that it's a tragedy that the situation in Basra deteriorated to the point where civilians felt they had no option aside to take to the streets to address very basic needs such as clean water. I think it is also tragic that this is unfolding at the same time as a protracted series of negotiations over the formation of the next Iraqi government, which is further paralyzing an Iraqi response. I think Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi has made some important efforts to do what he can with his powers as Prime Minister to resolve the situation. Obviously, it has not been sufficient. So I do hope that we'll see more American engagement in Iraq, more American commitment to alleviating the humanitarian crisis, which is what it is really in Basra, and potentially even mobilizing some of Iraq's other neighbors, such as the Gulf states and American partners in the region that want to play a constructive role in Iraq, want to help balance Iran's interests in the region and investment in lethal capabilities, primarily in Iraq. And I think that we have an opportunity here. It is a crisis, but it is simultaneously an opportunity, and I hope that this administration recognizes it for both parts.
I just want to double stamp on a point that Jennifer made, which I think is a very good
Very
one.
quickly, because I have one more question and we're out of time.
Is that Basra is a perfect opportunity for the Gulf Arab states to increase their ability to influence the future of Iraq. Because Basra has a lot more similarities with the Gulf Arab states than it does with the rest of Mesopotamian Iraq.
Exactly. Now I want to talk about the Hariri trial because as we saw now it's starting again, and there's a lot of evidence that the Assad regime was responsible for this. And I want to ask you that, Jennifer, and then obviously Hezbollah. How do you see this moving forward, and how could it affect the Assad regime, or basically be another tool for the international community to go after Assad?
If we look at the Hariri Tribunal, that was the first line of effort to demonstrate the negative role that Syria has at times played in Lebanon, and that it's also a major front in a broader war about trying not to normalize Hezbollah. And where I see the current dynamics in the Hariri Tribunal having significance as it has to do with Syria is it's another point that can be raised about why not to re-normalize Bashar al-Assad, to remind the international community that we actually had a series of protest movement that happened in 2005. Prior to the Syrian uprising, and it was tied to Bashar al-Assad's desire to dominate Lebanon and to make Lebanon just another particular province of Syria. So where I see it have an impact is it's going to be used as an additional arrow in the quiver of anti-Assad actors that want to prevent the normalization of Assad, and particularly in Europe.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Nicholas, for joining me today. I would love to have you again in the future.
Thank you.
That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for sticking with us. Good night.